Wow, we have a large group tonight. And happily, I've met a few of you over the last year. And for those of you who don't know me, I guess a little bit about me is a good place to start. I'm an organizational consultant, and I think what I most enjoy is working with people, helping them to resolve the issues that stand in the way of their moving forward and their organizations moving forward. I've really always been excited about business since I first started a number of years ago, and I've worked in a wide variety of industries. My work takes me from the boardroom to the factory floor and lots of points in between. I've really been happy to be here with you guys over the last year. It's been fun being back with a group where everybody seems to have some connection with software development. And I think maybe the reason for that is that a large portion of my early career spent in IT was in integrating new software and hardware into the operational side of the business. What I want to share with you tonight is some things that I learned when I first started working as an organizational consultant. They actually became a part of my work. They were very helpful for me. They were very helpful for the organizations I was working in. They're the foundation of a lot of what I'm going to talk about tonight, so I hope they're going to be helpful for you. A lot of it is a little bit new, so this will be your kind of a challenge evening, but let's see how it goes. So what are we going to talk about tonight? Primarily the importance of quality decision and what it takes to make them. And the second thing we're going to talk about are some elements that are in the organization that we need to pay attention to if our organizations are going to be successful in the long term. So I would say probably in the past few years, there's been a real effort to reduce the amount of time it takes to make decisions, moving them closer to where the decisions actually will be used. We call that reducing decision latency. But when we get our decisions down to where they're actually being used, we still have two really important questions. The first one is, can we reduce decision latency anymore? And the second one is, and this one is really more important to me, or certainly as important, and that is, what kind of decisions are we making at that point? Are we making decisions that will provide the best possible outcome for our organizations? And before I go on a little bit, I guess I'd like to know what you guys think, in maybe 3 or 4 words, is a quality decision. Anybody?
Based on a model.
Based on a model, okay.
Well-informed.
Well-informed, I like that one.
One that you look back on with pleasure a year from now.
Okay, I'll vote for that one. That sounds good. One more.
One that's finally made.
I like that too. And David?
One that's fully supported.
Okay, all right. So keep those in mind for about the next 30 minutes, and then we'll see see what it looks like 30 minutes from now. The other thing we want to look at is some elements that are in the organization that really don't get too much attention. As we begin to move Agile principles into the larger organization, we often run into some resistance. We hear people say, you can't build an Agile organization with a waterfall management group. Or you hear Agile coaches saying, gee, I told that guy something. I told him how to do it the Agile way, only to discover that his manager countermanded what I said. So one of the things we want to do is take a look at some of these elements that underlie waterfall mentality and see if we can move that along a little bit. You'll notice on the screen that I tucked in the word history there. There is a good reason for that. I think it makes some sense to give you a little bit of history before we begin. Because probably there's been a body of knowledge called complexity science that's been building for the last 30 years, since the 80s. And this area of knowledge provides a solid foundation for what we're going to talk about tonight. Okay, so complexity science got its start in the 80s on a shoestring budget in an old convent in Santa Fe with a small group of scientists who were beginning to make sense of their world in a different way. They were beginning to ask questions that defied conventional categories. And over time, this little group grew. It included people from all disciplines, including people from business. Credentials of all sorts, from Nobel laureates down to academic postdocs. And they came together and they shared with one another the pressing questions in each of their disciplines. And when they got past the jargon, they realized they were all asking the same or similar questions. So what kind of questions were they asking? Among them these. But what's important for us? I think the question is, how is it that some organizations thrive? They really flourish. And they give a great deal to society for a period of time. And then in a flash, they're just gone. So one of the people that was important at the Santa Fe Institute, and that's important for us tonight, is a man by the name of John Holland. And he actually got a mention by Sutherland in his book on Scrum. Holland had several questions, and his first one really laid the foundation for what we know about decisions. The first question was really rather basic. What kind of decisions do we make that move the organization forward? You'll find me translating a lot of this stuff from science side to organizational side, but that's actually okay. And then the other question is, if they're going to be successful, exactly what kind of decisions do those need to be? Okay, let me go back a minute. So while the Santa Fe Institute was really growing and getting some feet on the ground, at the same time, computers were becoming much more powerful and sophisticated. So the guys at Santa Fe, including Holland, were able to use them to test out some of their hypotheses. And Holland in particular used a computer simulation process called agent-based modeling or agent-based simulation to test out his hypotheses. And I want to show you a little bit of that simulation so you'll get an idea of what was the basis for his research. And the other thing that will happen is you'll be able to see a little bit of what happens when individuals function under different decision-making rules. And who is it in the room that was talking about war games and simulation? Okay, this is kindergarten. So what happens in agent-based simulations? One of the things that happens is that an agent is assigned a set of decision-making rules and set free. They move about a grid following the rules they've been assigned. And then the patterns that emerge are analyzed. What happens is that what's going to happen in our simulation is that our agents are going to be, we have an agent, and each agent has two random opponents, A, an aggressor, and B, a defender. And in the first simulation we're going to look at, which is called the aggressor, our agents are told to have B stand between themselves and A. And so you get a pattern that looks something like this. In our second simulation, the agents are told to become defenders. They're told to defend B against A. And they're told to put themselves between A and B. Yeah, kind of interesting. Okay, so the importance of this is that each individual operating under a set of decision-making rules makes choices that contribute to an overall pattern. And that pattern, in turn, enables the organization to move forward. More fun? You can go to ecosystem if you got that. Okay, we're having a little... Okay. So let's come back to Holland again and come back to his very first question. Again, he's asking, what is it the decisions that we make in organization? And are there guidelines that would help us understand how to make the organization move forward in a more successful way? And that's largely what his research was about. Okay, so what did we learn from Holland? First of all, we learned that complex systems organizations move forward on a day-to-day basis, making decisions. What they know is if they want to be successful, they prefer to make decisions using a set of guidelines rather than acting randomly. They want between 3 and 8 guidelines. You probably know that number because that kind of range of number comes up a lot in terms of teams and other things that we think about as we're going forward with Agile. They also want more explicit guidelines. So there's a range between 3 and 8, as I said. The interesting thing that they found is that decision-making rules are not cast in concrete. As people go forward and learn, those decision-making rules evolve and change over time. Taken overall, the importance of Holland's work is that his research clearly showed that complex systems, that organizations need a clear set of guidelines underlying the decisions that they make. A really important point. But given that, we're able to go forward and begin to think more specifically about what kind of decision-making rules we need in our organizations. So beyond Holland, other researchers came by, more powerful computers, more sophisticated simulation processes, and what they discovered is that there were 4 different kinds of decision-making rules with remarkably different outcomes. I'm not going to speak about them in this particular order. What I'd like to do is talk about them. We'll do type 2, type 3, type 4, which are the ones that are important to us. And then I'll close out by coming back to type 1. So type 2, what kind of companies function under type 2 rules? These are companies that believe that they've arrived. They're not so much, they don't see the landscape imposing on what it is they do. They're kind of isolated from the landscape. They like the status quo, and they don't really change until something in the external environment comes in and forces them to change. Growth and development does not come from within the company. And so the question I have for you guys is, does anybody work in a company that has type 2 rules? A company like this? Yeah, you can raise your hand. I won't take names. We'll just, David, not you. What? You don't have to say anything. Okay, so I didn't write anything down. Okay, so type 3. What kind of companies operate under type 3 rules? Some, but not all, early stage entrepreneurial companies, primarily those with highly creative founders. You know, it gets pretty chaotic. Okay, let's come to where we would like to be. Type 4s. What did they see in simulation? They saw complex patterns, unending patterns that moved across the screen, broke apart, and then came back together. The important word here is unending. And that's to say that as things demanded it and new development happened, recombination happened, but the structures were unending. So what we have here from an organizational side are organizations that have long-term success, that have been able to maintain success over a long period of time. And the rules that were used here went back to Holland, and they went back to other researchers. So let's take a look at them. Okay, we already know we needed 3 to 8. We also wanted more explicit guidelines. But the guidelines, the first guideline is a guideline that relates to the identity of the company. In other words, does the decision we make, is it in alignment with the enterprise identity? Any decision that we make has to support the way the organization thinks about itself. In a couple of minutes, I'm going to talk a lot about identity, but just know that it's part of the, one thing it does, it's part of the first guideline. The second guideline relates to the environment. Does the decision we make, how does it relate to the larger ecosystem in which we live and do business? And how does it relate to the individuals who work in the company? The next ones, and there can be up to 6 of them, relate to the group that you're in. So if you're in a productivity group, you might find something like rules around what's the trade-off between cost cutting and quality? Or if you're in another kind of a group, it may be, what's the relationship between customer service and a more efficient process going on in the company? So you can build those rules. The thing we know about these guidelines, besides these, is that they're organic. They're built from within, and everybody understands what they are. The second thing is that they're unique to the company. Where the company is in its own evolution. They're specific to the company. And the third thing is that they're developed by a group. I faded out there. They're developed by a group. It's not a top-down process, and it could be something like a cross-functional team that maybe has responsibility for products and projects and other activities. Okay, before we go back to our question about decision latency, take a minute and think about just get some ideas about some guidelines you might have for your group. Name your group and then think about what the guidelines might be. No, you don't have to write a guideline, just think 3 or 4 words. What you might use, what you might think would be important in a guideline for your group. And you can either tell me or the guy next to you. That would be cool. I'll give you a minute to think about that. Oh, good.
One could be, respect for people, so showing up, starting meetings on time, and meetings on time, all that stuff would be a general guideline.
Okay, that was cool. Anyone else? Yes, you can say it and I can repeat it if he doesn't get to you on time.
So one would be, if there's any doubt, do what's right for the customer.
Okay, customer first.
As opposed, well, not so much customer first as a slogan, but more like,
So empowered to spend money or to make commitments for the customer as opposed to business interests within limits.
All right, sounds good.
In the industry I work in, which is medical products,
right.
The quality process involves creating a quality policy, a written quality policy that all employees have to see, which covers the first 2 items: what the company is,
right,
and what its core beliefs are about quality and about the types of products that they put together.
All right, so you feel like you're working under Type 4 rules, you would say, given where you are. That's excellent.
Operate with integrity.
Okay, who said that?
Yeah, integrity.
Oh, okay, great. All right, sounds good. All right. So let's come back to one more. Go ahead.
Permission to interrupt the status quo.
Okay. All right, sounds good. All right. So let's come back to our original question about whether or not we can reduce decision latency at the point where decisions are being made. What we find is that when you have criteria for making decisions, you get an increase in speed in decision making, and that happens at the individual level. It also happens at the meeting level. In meetings, there's less debate. There's less discussion. People know where it is you're going to go with the meeting. And the last thing it does is it provides clear justification for decisions. So people can say, I made this decision in this way. It increases the level of confidence around the decisions that are being made, and that's also a good thing. Okay, and this is just a little thing about from Capital One CIO that in addition to everything else, they got a reduction in turnover from 20% to 4% when they started working with decision-making rules. Was very helpful. Okay, the last thing I'd like to do before leaving Type 4 is take a quick look at a company that's been running under Type 4 rules for over 100 years. I want to apologize up front. This is a manufacturing company, so a number of you probably can't relate to this, but I chose it because we have records of it for 115 years, and that lets us see a little bit of what's going on with the company over a long period of time. This is the American Cast Iron Pipe Company. It's down. It says it's in Birmingham, Alabama. The thing that you want to know about pipe manufacturing is that it's really labor intensive and it's extremely hot, 130 degrees at the smelting units. John Egan, who was the founder and also sole proprietor for a period of time, thought his success rested in two things. Customer service, providing his customers exactly what they needed in terms of pipes, and also in terms of providing a space where his employees could be healthy and continue their personal development, which was an unusual thing back in the early 1900s. But let's look quickly at John's customers. His customers wanted much faster pipe production. That's what they were about. They wanted quality pipes, and they wanted some pipes that met their unusual specifications. So if you look at this company, they focused a lot on continuing to be efficient through the pipe manufacturing, through mechanization, through anything that came along, new innovations in pipe manufacturing, looking at their distribution channels to get things to their customers faster. When they could, they became more digital and took into account the external environment. And if you look up there, that you can also see that they did some pretty fine stuff for their customers in terms of making records with the size pipes that they produced. But if you look at what he did in his employee environment, we see a really important picture. Anything on this list was a first of its kind in the nation. They set standards for employee satisfaction. He built schools and churches. He built employee stores, all kinds of things. This company was so well thought of that from 1997 to 2005, it was in the Fortune 100 best companies to work for. And at one point, they had 10,000 people applying for 100 job slots. That's probably a good measure of success. So, all right. So that's it for me for Type 4. And I promised you before I left that I would tell you a little bit about Type 1 rules. If you remember back in the simulations, these were called doomsday. And that was because after 1 or 2 time cycles, the screen went blank. These companies operating under Type 1 don't actually go out of business in short order. Some of them are around for a long time. We'll look at one. And some of them can be profitable. What we see in companies is a primary rule that's in use, and every other rule in the company is there to support the primary rule. We see this happening in whole companies. We also see this happening in specialized teams. We, in fact, were working with a productivity team with an international consumer good company. We interviewed 25 people. Every single one of them volunteered. They tell us it's about productivity. We know it's about cost cutting. And they were totally focused on how much more water they could put in their shampoo. That's what it is. Okay. So if we look at some of these single rule and use companies, what we see is there's not much exploration to find new things that would be helpful to the company. Everybody's really focused on comply with the rule. And one of the important things here is growth is at the expense of people and the environment. So let's go back and look at another successful pipe company. This is McWane, also in Birmingham. This is actually an offshoot of ACIPCO. McWane was the president, and he said, not doing that human resource stuff. We don't need to deal with the people here. I can be profitable with a disciplined management approach, which I'm going to call the McWane way. And he took himself out and he opened up a pipe shop across on the other side of town, driving it with a single rule in use. And if you go into their company, on all the walls, in all the rooms, is a sign, reduce man hours per ton. That's what they're all about. And yes, they're profitable. I think they're at about $2 billion a year. But they did that at the expense of people. If you look at the list, 9 people killed in their plant. 4,600 out of 5,000 people injured. Some of them loss of limb. Last 7 years, safety violations more than the 6 nearest competitors. Highest EPA fines. But I tell you what, $52 million in fines, not much if you're making $2 billion. It's just the cost of doing business. They did make the 10 worst companies list. So they consider them profitable. I mean, they consider themselves a success because they make money. But in fact, nobody else would consider them a success. Are desperate for work, that don't care about themselves or their environment. Their actual main draw are ex-cons from the local penitentiary, is what's supplying the stuff there. Okay, so what we've been talking about so far.
Next slide.
Why?
No, I'm sorry.
Would you like me to do that? No, I don't want to do the next slide yet.
Went forward and then back to
No, I went forward because I said, okay, this is the end of the stuff on rules. We're going to go to elements. And I wanted to say before we left that what we've been dealing with is the importance of criteria in making decisions, not only because it offers the best possible outcome for our organizations, but also because it reduces decision latency. So that's cool. Okay, so let's come back. Complexity tells us that there's more to making organizations successful than just having good decisions, although good decisions are clearly really important. So when we look at Holland had a second question. And his question was, and I can read this, do complex systems, whether they're cells or organizations or the planet, have common characteristics? The reason he was asking this question is because if there are common characteristics, they must be important. They must be important for survival and for growth. And for us, we think about common characteristics if we want the organization to function in an optimal way. Okay, so what did Holland find? Holland found and established 7 common characteristics. We're probably only going to deal with the first 3 tonight. Let me say that another way. We're going to deal with the first 3 tonight. And the first one is going to be identity. Okay, so I think of identity as playing a significant role in the success of an organization, of bringing an organization forward in a way that allows it not only to survive but also to be productive. But the other thing that we find is that when an identity is not clear, when it's not coherent, it tends to underlie waterfall mentality. It has a part to play in that. And so let's look at it a little bit more. So the first thing about identity is you want to make sure that you don't confuse it with brand. Brand tends to be something that's developed from the outside, a marketing company, and then imposed on, integrated into the company in that way. But identity is generally formed from within, and it's formed when the company is founded. So let's take a quick break and think about, no, I'm not going to give you an exercise yet, just wait, that's coming. But just let's think about a little story about a little company that some of you know called Life is Good. You know, the two brothers that wanted to form a t-shirt company. So out of their apartment in Cambridge, they would design a t-shirt, they would have it produced, and they would drive up and down the East Coast trying to sell it to colleges in their van. The important thing is the time they spent in their van, because they talked about the values they had and exactly what kind of a company they wanted it to be. What was their identity going to be? And what they found was that the value that they cherished the most was a positive message in a negative world. That was most important to them. So when they came up with the design, the iconic stick figure, maybe some of you know it, called Jake, and the phrase underneath that says life is good, they had a positive message in a negative world, and their company took off. It was a product just gangbusters. The important thing is that the identity carried them forward through some really trying times. When 9/11 came along, they were afraid they were done for. How could they offer a positive message with such a tremendous event? But what they decided was to use what they had and do something for the survivors of 9/11. And they discovered in the process, by sticking to their message, that they could now go into philanthropy, do things in the community, as well as doing something retail. And that's a little bit of what they're known for today. So that's a little bit about identity getting formed. Okay. I want to talk a little bit about, let me just think here for a minute. I want to turn now to the identity of a company that's not clear and that's not coherent, and plays a little bit into some waterfall mentality. We're going to look at an advertising company. This is about 12 years ago, about the time that technology was first coming into advertising and really making some inroads. So a new president comes into a division. We sit down, we have an interview with him, and ask him what he sees is going to be the identity of his company. And he says it's going to be a leader in creative advertising using technology. Next question, if that's the case, what is the company going to look like? What are you going to see going on in the company? And he was very clear. He said, we want to give our customers creative advertising using technology so that they'll be able to go forward with their own marketing. We want to do a really good job of that. And if that's going to be the case, then what's going to be pervasive in the organization is a breakthrough thinking and a high level of creative curiosity. He also said that given the space that we're in, we want dynamism, we want athleticism, we want an entrepreneurial culture. That's just the way it has to be. And given the fact that we have multifunctions, they call them capabilities, on any contract, whether it's large or small, we need to have, what I expect to see is shared accountability and collaboration, everybody working together. So our job was really to come in and to understand what needed to change in the company. That's what we were about. So I'm going to show you a little bit about what we found. In terms of athleticism, dynamism, entrepreneurial, that wasn't there. They were highly risk averse, which we thought might be attributed to a couple of things. For one thing, 40% of their revenues came from a single legacy automobile company. They were unwilling to take a risk, to do things differently. They were afraid that they would lose the client if they did. This was really pervasive. They knew it was an old way of doing things, but by golly, it worked and it produced revenue. The other reason why we thought they might be risk averse is that a lot of the company was headquartered in New York City, and when 9/11 happened, they suffered a lot of financial setbacks. And so they became quite conservative. So what we were seeing in this company when we stepped back with this was it was mired in waterfall thinking. There's an old way of doing things. We're not going to change. We like the status quo. We have no interest, we have no intention of adapting to a changing world in which technology is going to play a major role. Big barrier for going forward. The other thing we wanted to know is, so we knew what the president thought the identity was. What did the people in the organization think the identity was? And they came back and said, some of them actually did think, the later hires thought, well, it is a creative, interactive agency. That's cool. But for the most part, the people in the organization had no sense of identity. It was pretty fluid. And one of them said, gee, I have a hard time keeping up with identity, either externally or internally, because it changes so frequently. So when we had finished the assessment, what the company was able to know was that it wanted to find a way to develop a coherent and clear identity. And so it set about putting a group of people together rather than going out and getting somebody to develop a brand. They worked from within to develop an identity for themselves that would fit with, I'm a leader in creative advertising using technology. They also understood they needed to, so that was a way to move the company forward in a really positive way. What's the identity? How can I get this company going in a positive way? But they also needed to do something to reduce the risk aversion in the company, because that is clearly holding them back. And so what they decided to do in this company, given where it was, is that the president was having breakfast, so he started introducing the idea. He had taken risks. It was important for his growth, and it was something that he supported. The managers decided to have lunch and learns, to talk about how to learn from mistakes and why that was important. And then human resources got in there and began to think about how to handle annual reviews, again to support the idea that mistakes are a good thing. Previously, people hadn't talked about mistakes there. So what I would say is that what we find is a lot of what we call waterfall mentality. There's a lot about risk aversion caused by multiple things, not just by, it's not just a single thing. You absolutely have to do something about it. But the way you do something about it really depends upon what it is, where it comes from, and what the company is ready to do, what your organization is ready to do. So it's subtle stuff, but it's important stuff. Okay, so do I see a head nodding, or should I just ignore that? Okay, so the second common element that we want to look at is flows. It's another common element. And it has a lot to do with networks. And there was a time when we would all think about supply chains, distribution, and things like that. But what we realize in organizations now is information is a critical resource that needs to flow both effectively and efficiently. But I would dare say that those of you that are working on teams really do get information flowing quite efficiently. And if you don't get it flowing efficiently, you know what to do to make it so. But let's talk about a couple of other things, a couple of other areas in the organization where we want to see optimal information flow. You know what? I forgot to do an exercise on identity. What?
Go ahead and do it now.
All right, we can do it now. I was just going to ask you to think about four different, maybe four different words that would define the identity of your companies. Are you all clear about your company's identities? Think about a couple of words. She's smiling. Do you want to go first?
I'm sitting with people I work with, so I'm not.
All right. So the question is, do all of you think the same? Would all of you say the same thing? Okay, go ahead.
Consensus driven.
Okay. Good words.
Two words, educate
Okay.
and distribute information.
Okay.
Companies providing education to doctors.
Okay, sounds good. Anyone else? All right, I can do it. 19 minutes? I don't need 19. I'll give you some time back. I've been watching the clock and thinking I only had until 8:05. So we're cool. We're good. I like what you're doing. Okay, so, all right. So that was the part on identity. Sorry, I missed that. So the second thing we're looking at, the second common element is called flows. And as I said, it has everything to do with networks, whether they're seen or they're not seen. And where I left off, I think, is saying that I think you guys that work on teams probably get really efficient information flow. And if you don't, you know how to make it. You know how to make it so. But there are two other things that in the organization would be fun to talk about that contribute to information flow. And one of them is an individual who acts as a hub, an information hub. You maybe know somebody like this, a person on your team, a person in a larger organization. Usually, typically, they've been in the organization for a period of time. They've held multiple roles. And I have to tell you, I met a guy a couple of weeks ago. He'd been in this organization for over 30 years. I got to tell you, the guy had several numbers of jobs. And boy, what a resource. You need a guy like that around. All right, so the important thing about these guys is that usually they make themselves available to share. And information, the flow of information is actually pretty efficient because they're giving you what you need when you need it. And so I always say to people, if you're going to work in the larger organization, you're on a new project, find a hub, because they will give you an amazing amount of information that will be helpful for you as go forward. So we think about individuals who act as hubs as supporting a positive flow of information, sort of contributing to optimal flow. But there's another area where, we'll come back to them in a minute. There's another area where there's information flow, but it can be notoriously inefficient, and that's meetings. And so we'll go back to our advertising company and see a little bit of the things that came up during the assessment. And I'm going to read you just a couple of the quotes that we heard. This date is 12 years old, so I feel I feel pretty good about sharing it. And man, when I get finished with it, I'm going to tell you one other thing about this little digital marketing company, because there was a happy ending to it. Anyway, somebody says, everybody's such a high flyer in this place. There's a perception of, this is an important meeting. How can I not go? One thing about cost. It makes us more expensive because ultimately that person in that meeting is being billed. That person didn't really have to be there. And I don't want to charge that back to my client. And then the last thing about 20%, meetings running 20% longer than is needed, that's because everybody's polite. And they allow everything to be repeated once or twice or more. And I'll tell you how the company ended up when we get finished with the section on flows. We don't want to ruin something. Okay, so meetings are an important vehicle for moving organizations forward. We don't think about them that way, but they are. Because they're a place where information can be exchanged in an efficient way. But frequently that doesn't happen. So if we come back a little bit to complexity, indeed, there's something to be said about the right number of people coming to the meeting. If you have too many, the meeting's going to be diluted. Especially if you have people coming into the meeting that don't really need to be there. They often come in with a mindset that doesn't fit with what you're trying to do. So the suggestion is, if you find your meeting list getting to be a little over long, and you're looking at it and saying, not all these people need to be here, don't hesitate. Step out and redesign how you're trying to reach your goals. See what other kinds of things that you can do as you go along. The other important thing is usually when you have a meeting, you have a goal, and you want to make sure you're bringing the right information into the room to get that job done. So whether it comes in with somebody on their 2 feet, or whether you're bringing it in on slides or whatever, make sure you get the right information in the room, and then also make sure that when the meeting is over, that information gets disseminated in a way that it gets to the people where it needs to be. If you have a meeting that's efficient and effective and all those good things, you get an increase in collaboration and cohesion in the company. So the meeting serves multiple purposes, and that's also a good thing. Okay, so where we've been in talking about flows is that we need to make sure that they're running, that the particularly information flow is efficient and effective if we're going to optimize our organizations. And we've been talking about people information hubs that provide a good transfer of information, bringing information where it's needed in an effective way. But we've also been talking about meetings, which more often than not need a little bit of our attention to ensure that there's an optimal exchange of information going on in the room. Okay, before I go on to the next element and the last element for the evening, I just want to go back to our little advertising company and tell you that was 12 years ago. And when you saw from the things that came out of the assessment, we had a data book that was pretty thick, full of things that would be helpful for the company as they were trying to change. For the last 4 years, they have been a leader in Gartner's Magic Quadrant for global marketing agencies. And they've also very recently taken a prize at Cannes for their creative advertising. So a really good ending to a story that started out problematically 12 years ago. Okay, the last thing I want to talk about tonight is an element called aggregation. And I got to tell you, this word, aggregation, I tried changing it. I tried putting other words on top of it. This is a little scientific. But the words I used took us down the wrong route. So I finally can...
I don't know what it means.
Well, we're going to talk about it and what it means. And what I was going to say to you is, do you remember the days when you had your vocabulary word of the day? Back in school, we all had our vocabulary, 10 days or 10 words a day for we were going to be brilliant in vocabulary. This is your vocabulary word of the day, is aggregation. And it really has to do, as I said, with how day-to-day practices contribute to the overall well-being. But I think also with aggregation, it's easier to give you an example of it first and then talk about what it is, so you'll get a clear sense of it. So we're going to use a company that probably a lot of you know about called Menlo Innovations. Provides innovative consulting to the tech industry, including software development and design. Okay, so when Rick Sheridan started his company, he did a lot of trial and error around processes that he wanted to use in his company. And he finally settled on 4. The first one is very short work cycles. Their teams rotate out every week. And what they get as a result of that is clear, reliable, maintainable code. The second thing that they do is they use pairing. So 2 at a computer at a time doing programming. And as performance measurements show that that's 10 times faster than programming individually. And I also got to tell you then when I checked my notes, I went back to my source to make sure it was 10 times and not 10%. The third thing is their particular way of doing staffing. When the company started out, the small group, they had collaboration, they had adaptability, they had transparency, they had trust. They didn't want to lose that. So what they did is that anytime they began to hire a new person, they would sort of bring them in the first day for speed dating. Then they would bring them in for 1 day of work, and if everybody was satisfied, they hired them for a week. And if everybody was still satisfied, they hired them for a month. And if they were still coming strong, they hired them permanently. And the reason for that is that they believe that a fit on culture is really important. And that so long as somebody has a basic set of tech skills that they're looking for, they can increase those tech skills. But it's hard to increase a cultural fit. Then the last thing that they do is that when they have a new contract or a new project with a current client, they send people out to the organization and so that they can learn about the people in the environment. But in addition to that, they learn the vocabulary, they learn the workflow, they learn the habits, they learn the hopes, they learn the dreams, and then they come back to the office and they design a software experience accordingly. So some of these you might say, gee, these are kind of barbaric kind of processes. These are really kind of tough. But what they get as a result of it is that the staff is able to move along and do their work without somebody looking over their shoulder. But the other thing that they get is an identity, and I guess I could ask any one of you, what is the word that you most closely associate with Menlo Innovations? Joy. So what they get is joyful clients and joyful employees. So now we can talk about what is aggregation. Yeah, I think that's what I wanted to say about that. So aggregation is really some sort of an emergent property for the organization. And it comes as a result of processes and interactions of people at the lower group. So in this case, you've got Menlo's 4 rigid processes that work, and you've got joy. And I think if I asked a number of you, you would say, okay, we have strict agile processes that we're working with, and the word we're going to use to describe our company is agility, or agile. So the importance of aggregation as a common element is that those global descriptors, if you think about it, joy, joyful customers and people and agility, are things that drive the company forward, things that help the organization survive successfully. So you don't necessarily get joy and agility just by having processes and interactions at a lower action. I know you can think of a few words that you get. What comes to mind for me is stressful. That's a word somebody might use to describe an organization. Or if you were at McWane, it could be lethal. It would be another word. And if you think about those 2 words, you can think in a moment that those kind of global characteristics are not characteristics that are going to drive the company forward. So when you begin to see, in terms of, okay, what are we going to do with this common element? How's it going to help us? When we begin to see things at that level that are defining the company in a way that we realize are not going to be really helpful or supportive, it's time to take a look at the lower processes and the lower interactions. Does that help you with what aggregation is? I realized when you asked me, I couldn't give you a dictionary. I only know it from the use of it. Okay, this shouldn't be in here, but it still is. Okay, in closing, what I want to say is that hopefully this evening what we've done is develop an understanding that having criteria for making decisions in our organizations is a critical thing, both in terms of bringing the most positive outcome that we can to our organizations, and also in terms of decreasing decision latency. And that the other thing is these little elements that we have that we find that we need to pay attention to in order to reduce waterfall mentality, that if they are functioning optimally and if they're working, then indeed we can have very successful companies going forward. And with that, I give you back your time.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Any questions?
Questions? Yes.
So one of the things I was wondering is complex adaptive systems theory, the 3 to 8 guidelines and so forth, and the sort of breakdown, reformation of things over time in an organization. Do you see that as because you're hitting a boundary and and the guidelines, the simple rules are becoming more than what people can internalize, and so then it breaks down into reforms?
Yeah, I think the thing, my take of it, when I looked at the simulations originally, the time that they got on ending structures was when the guy added the identity of what it was they were modeling. When he added the essence was what was drawing it forward. So I think that, I'm not sure, I mean, I read a lot, but I don't know what the scientific dynamics would be in terms of why that happened that way. But it just seems to be, what they found out in the simulations. So, ask me again your question.
So I'm interested in the dynamics of why structures change and when.
Right.
So I get involved with like transformations. And
Right.
I often wondered, do big companies especially, if
Right.
they lost their identity and is entering into some sort of transformation, a way to help them recenter themselves, is that part of the breaking down of their current structures to reform? And what's the real dynamic beneath it, other than, oh, it's the bright, shiny object that's a cool way people are doing it?
Right. Well, if we go back to our little advertising company,
Yeah.
you would probably see that there. You had I think the company, I'm not sure how many employees, let's say 1,800. The division we were in was 600. And they had an old way of working. They'd been around for a while. They had an old way of interacting. The creative guys were problematic because they were really, really negative. I mean, they just, on whatever. But when the time came, there was a recombination. In other words, they began to, instead of having the structure that they had before, they began to having marketing teams. Instead of just having marketing going out and guys who then threw it over the transom to the production guys who then did whatever they did, they in fact began to send people out as a unit. So there you see a recombination that's going on and a shift. So you have a shift in dynamics, you have a shift in identity, that's the kind of thing that I see happening. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, no, I think it does.
Okay.
So, well, yeah,
Okay, we could talk more.
sure.
But it sounds like an offline. It's complicated.
Yeah.
It sounds like it's a good question, and I'd like to explore it with you. Yes.
Yeah, you're talking in terms of flow, and information flow, and have the two things of either meetings or an individual as a hub. And I'm thinking there are some other ways, if it's information flow, looking at it maybe less individual dependent, like maybe you have a good intranet
Right.
or an internal
Right.
social media site.
Right.
Things like that. How would those things play in terms of getting information to flow out that would make it less dependent on one or a few individuals?
Well, there is a lot of work that's been done on internet networks in terms of flow of information. That's really been important. My choice tonight was only to use something very simple to introduce a concept of flow as a common element, of something we need to pay attention to. But I think indeed, what they find is similar things in terms of hubs within the internet, in terms of how information is flowing through. They find a lot of the same characteristics. Hubs with information flowing over connectors and things of that sort. So, good question. Yeah, I mean, this tonight was just really like, sort of scratching the surface. I didn't know how this would go over because I realize it's a little different than what people are used to getting. You're shaking your head. What would you say?
It complements the Agile technical things very well.
Yeah. Yeah.
When you were talking about meetings in the context of flow,
Right.
It appeared to me that you were concerned about the efficiency of the meeting,
Right.
and having the meeting make a decision, having the people required for that decision at the meeting,
Right.
not extra people. So what's your feeling about meetings that are just intended to exchange information, to get everybody up to speed for everybody to know what other people are working on, and in the hopes that there will be, somebody who will hear what somebody else is doing, and just have an idea that helps that advance.
I'm totally supportive of that. I think it's open, and I think it's good, in terms of an exchange of information. It's just a way in tonight, in terms of capsulizing, sort of putting a little bit of discipline about what a meeting is in terms of right number of people and that kind of thing. But I think there are a lot of forums in which having numbers of people in the room just exchanging ideas is very good, because it's thought starting, and it brings a certain amount of diversity in terms of people being able to say, bounce off somebody else's ideas in terms of what they need. So I think that's important too. I wouldn't limit it just to this kind of a meeting.
Right, so I agree with that. I appreciate your support of it, but from your presentation, it sounded to me like that wasn't a kind of meeting you would have liked.
No, it wasn't a like or dislike. It was just like, okay, where are we exchanging information? We're doing it in meetings. We have a lot of different kinds. And in a sense, if the goal of your meeting is to bring forward all the different ideas of everybody working in this group, by all means, that's what you're going to do. And if you went back to the original guys that were building complexity, I mean, if you read about how the Santa Fe Institute got its start, that's basically what they did. They got a bunch of people in the room for a week or 6 weeks or a week conference, and everybody just shared stuff until they began to find out what the common grounds were. So really productive meetings, I think.
Thank you.
Last couple of questions.
Okay.
How do you think that this helps companies protect themselves against market disruption, or does it? New technologies that you see force companies that have been around forever that rely on one product, like your American cast iron pipe company.
Right.
If someone comes along with a new pipe that's half the weight and just as strong and half the cost, can they, is the way they work, does that protect them?
Well, you see the last slide that I said I wasn't going to get into, which was about internal models. That had a lot to do with anticipating shifts in the landscape. And being able, if you have an internal model that's flexible, like Agile, that when you see something happening out there you think you want to bring into your company, if your model is flexible enough, like Agile, then you can bring it in, you can begin to work with it. And then you begin to have a shift in the way you're going forward. So that works, but we didn't get to that slide. I thought it was too esoteric, actually.
Okay. Last question.
Did you have one? Oh, yes.
The company that I work for, we had started out with 3 Agile teams.
Right.
Really small 2-pizza teams. We delivered a minimum viable product, very exciting.
Okay.
3 years later, we're now up to over 20 teams.
Okay.
And what we're seeing is, if we were to look at any of the individual teams, in terms of identity, flow, aggregation, they're all doing pretty well.
Yeah.
But when you get all the teams together, it's almost like, it's kind of like Tower of Babel-ish, or almost like a bunch of fiefdoms, not really working well together.
Right.
It's absolutely crushing this organization.
Wow, okay.
And so what are some ways to kind of acknowledge that and to start thinking about a plan of attack?
Well, I'm not so sure I would think about a plan of attack. More so, what is your goal with your 20 teams? What is it you want to accomplish with them?
Well, we want to deliver more features, better, and faster.
Okay. But
right? Drum and scale, exactly.
But it sounds like you've got stuff going on there that's really, it's not waterfall mentality, but there's something going on in the organization that's kind of keeping that from, some cultural thing that's keeping that from kind of meshing the way you want it to mesh. Do you think?
Yeah, probably. So we have, the microphone.
We have 4 different geographies, so that's challenging in terms of setting aside time for meetings and things like that. Hard to really hear people on a WebEx.
Right.
So there's that from a technical perspective.
Yeah.
And I also think there are differences of opinion on working styles.
Okay. I would,
in terms of Agile practices as well.
Okay. I would be glad to talk to you. I think we're almost out of question time, but I'd be glad to talk to you about it.
Thank you.
see what we can do.
Thank you.
Okay,
All right, folks, I think let's finish the business of the meeting, and then you guys can continue conversations with the speaker. So let's give a
thank you. Thanks, everybody.
thank you.
Thank you.